We have Iranian-backed threats, not just active in Iraq against U.S. bases, but active throughout the entire Middle East, where the U.S. has incredible economic interests. President Trump has made the position that it requires a greater response. He's put his cards on the table. And if Iran continues to arm the Houthis, if there's another attack against the United States, or its interests, or its allies, you can expect a kinetic response in Iranian territory.
The theme of today's show is FAFO. What does FAFO mean? F-A-F-O. It means F around and find out. This is an expression that's been circulating online for some time now, especially since the war broke out actually in Israel. But this FAFO really has to do with the President of the United States, Donald Trump. People have to understand that one of the most important elements of national security of the United States is the element of military deterrence. The threats must mean something. When the President of the United States speaks, the world must listen. If they don't, war will break out. If they do, there will be peace. That's the concept of peace through strength. Now, we saw the exact opposite of that under President Biden. If you recall, when the war broke out between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, President Biden put out a statement. I remember Kamala Harris parroting the exact statement, and the entire Democratic Party parroting the exact statement to Hezbollah in the north, trying to prevent them from engaging in the war, which would then cause the United States to get involved in the war as well. And the entire statement that the President of the United States at the time, Joe Biden, made was, don't. Not more, not less, just don't. The problem is they did. The very next day, the Hezbollah launched rockets into Israel. The word of the U.S. meant nothing. We saw the same thing under Obama when he drew a line in the sand about the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Assad uses the chemical weapons thereafter against his own people. The United States does nothing. Well, there's a new sheriff in town, and his name's President Donald Trump. He talks a big game, but his words actually have meaning. And when he tells the Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen to stop attacking U.S. interests and U.S. assets in the area, and they don't, there are going to be consequences. Similarly, when the U.S. says, Hamas, if you don't come to the table, if you don't agree to extend this ceasefire, if you don't release the damn hostages, all hell will break loose in Gaza. This is not just bluster. And when Hamas tried to get cute with the United States on this last deal, Steve Witkoff went on international television and said, that's not how the U.S. does business. If we come to an agreement, you're not going to try to change the terms last second and add new ridiculous terms like you did last time and the time before. That's not how the world will work with President Trump at the helm here. They effed around, and now all hell's broken loose in Gaza as well. So the Middle East is on fire today. I'm going to read a statement from the Department of Defense, at least a part of it that came out. The Department of Defense says, over the weekend, U.S. Central Command forces initiated a series of operations consisting of precision strikes against Iran-backed Houthis targets across Yemen to restore freedom of navigation and reestablish American deterrence, which is what we spoke about. That was a statement from the Parnell, the spokesperson. They threaten their personnel overseas. Houthi terrorists have launched missiles and one-way attack drones at U.S. warships over 170 times and at commercial vessels 145 times since 2003. The U.S., Parnell said, will continue to use overwhelming lethal force against the terrorist Houthi targets until the U.S. achieves its goal. And what is that goal? He says there is a very clear end state to this operation, and that begins the moment that the Houthis pledge to stop attacking our ships and putting American lives at risk. And the story in Gaza is actually very similar. After months of just sitting back and trying to make a deal, we've seen some hostages release. It was beautiful to see them release and hug their loved ones again. I mean, it's just emotional to even think about it. But Hamas thought that they can continue to play cute. And they did not continue to negotiate in good faith with the United States or with Israel. And they're holding still American hostages, including Eden Alexander from New Jersey. And when they F around, they find out, and that's what's happening. Now, some sources that I have in Israel have told me that this will not look anything like the previous invasion into Gaza. This is really an all hell will break loose invasion. The lives of many will be put at risk, and all of this can be put to an end very quickly if Hamas simply releases the hostages and puts down its weapons. Charlie Kirk the other day put out a video where he asked a question to someone who was challenging him about Israel and Hamas, and he said, what happens if Hamas puts down its weapons? And he said, well, the war would be over. And what would happen if Israel put down its weapons? And he said, there would be no more Israel. Now, Charlie, I'm not sure if you know where you got this great argument from, but Golda Meir is credited for making that exact same argument where she said, if they put down their weapons, there'll be no more war. If we put down our weapons, there'll be no more Israel. And that's the reality. And when it comes to foreign policy and diplomacy, nothing works unless there's actual deterrence. And that's what's being reestablished today in the Middle East under the leadership of President Donald Trump. But to discuss all of this, to really get a better understanding, particularly of the Houthis and what's happening there, we have with us my friend Gregg Groisman, who's the executive director of the Middle East Forum. It's a nonprofit that promotes American interests in the Middle East. Everybody must have seen him in the last couple weeks when he testified in Congress. He led the testimony in Congress where he unveiled all of the corruption at USAID and what the U.S. was funding through USAID all over the world. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what's next. We'll try to get a better understanding of Iran and why this all matters for U.S. interests. This is Standpoint, and I'm Gabe Groisman. Gregg Groisman, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Gabe.
Greg, my favorite thing to do is to really dive deep a little bit when things are happening. We live in a society today where everybody wants to become an expert on something the minute after it happens. We saw that during COVID, by the way. Like the second COVID hit, everybody was an expert at transmittable diseases and that kind of stuff when nobody knew anything. With wars, it's the same. When Russia-Ukraine broke out, everybody was an expert of Russia-Ukraine, even though they knew nothing. Me included, by the way. I had to learn. Now we're seeing, it looks like almost war breaking out with the United States and the Houthis in Yemen. At the same time, we see Israel re-engaging in Gaza. That's something we've spoken about a lot on the show. But I really wanted to bring you on in particular to help understand, what the hell's going on in Yemen, why it matters to the United States. I just wanted to read quickly some updates from the Department of Defense before we start, just on the initial wave of strikes against the Houthis. The initial wave was the U.S. hit 30 plus targets, including terrorist training sites, UAV infrastructure, weapons manufacturing, command and control centers. Then on the second wave, we targeted the headquarter locations, weapon storage facilities. On the third day, operations continued and will persist, is what they're saying. The attacks are continuing every single day now. What's going on? What precipitated this? Why is the U.S. engaging in Yemen?
So first of all, we have to recognize that the U.S. has a 222-year history of maintaining maritime interdiction forces against piracy and those who seek to rule the waves, going all the way back to our war against the Barbary pirates in North Africa back in the early 1800s. So this is a continuation of policy that the U.S. has had for centuries. If there is a threat to global shipping, even if it affects one U.S. freighter, one U.S. corvette, one U.S. cargo ship, it is the responsibility and mandate of the president to deploy the U.S. Navy to make sure that those waterways that should be traveled freely across the globe are safe for U.S. passage. So we have now President Trump having notified the Houthis earlier in the week that after their attack on more than 100 different targets that they had commenced since October 8th, October 9th, 2023, both civilian and military in nature, that he will not put up with their efforts to stymie global shipping, and especially U.S. commercial interests through the Bab el-Mandab, through the Suez Canal, and between the Mediterranean Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and into the Indian Ocean. He held his word. He was making sure that he picked the right targets. And now we're on day 4 of a sustained campaign against the Houthis in Yemen.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hope I'm going to ask our editors to put up a map because I did that this morning. It's important to understand even where Yemen is, where it sits. I mean, people have to understand the waterways and how that affects also the economy, right? If the U.S. is pushing on its economy, what would happen if we were to close, if they were able to close off that shipping route, and shipping would have to go from Asia around the Pacific. A lot of it does, but a lot of it also cuts through there and through the Suez Canal to the other side. There's a reason why wars have been fought in that region for so many centuries, right? And a lot of it has to do with exactly that waterway. Um, Help us understand a little bit. We know on the surface level, again, sort of keeping the theme of diving deep a little bit beyond the tweets that people read. We understand that the Houthis are funded and controlled by Iran. Help us understand Iran's interest there. Why Iran today is continuing to attack U.S. and U.S. interests in the region. We haven't even gotten to what the Houthis have been doing with Israel, which we'll get to in a little bit. But how does Iran play into this?
Sure. So the Houthis have always been a pain in the backside of Arab nationalists and Arab Republicans for the past 70, 80 years. We first had the king of Yemen come from a Houthi-related sect of Islam, the Zaydis. So going all the way back to the 1950s, there was war between Egypt and the Houthi-affiliated South Yemenis, Northern Yemenis. And then subsequently, for decades going forward, they always felt as if though they were sort of the bad boys of Yemen. But Iran's connection came in 2011, 2012, after the Houthis had been involved in a civil war in Yemen, and Iran saw this as an opportunity to use its overseas arm, the Al-Quds the Al-Quds force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, to start arming them, to start giving them missiles, training, logistics, and to create a southern front where Iran would be able to operate another proxy force, just like it does with Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Hamas, Shia militias in Iraq, because the one thing that was missing was the ability to threaten maritime traffic through the Suez Canal and south of the major sea area to the Western Indian Ocean. As a result of that, they really built up the Houthis missile force over the course of the last 13 or 14 years. So when Israel's war against Hamas began, after the invasion of southern Israel on October 7th, 2023, the Iranians saw the ability to use the Houthis as one of those 7 fronts that Israel fought its war on. Iran wouldn't have to get its fingers dirty until later on in the war because it had a reliable southern ally in which it could activate, not just against Israel, but against any Western ally of Israel, and just in general, and more importantly, I think for this discussion, against the United States.
Yeah, I'm going to read for the listeners the tweet from President Trump, or let's be more accurate, his Truth Social post. I think it was yesterday or the day before, where he wants to explain sort of when it comes to the messaging, how Iran is really behind this. I'm going to read all of it, so just give me a minute. It says, "Let nobody be fooled. The hundreds of attacks being made by the Houthis, the sinister mobsters and thugs based in Yemen, who are hated by the Yemeni people, all emanate from and are created by Iran," in all caps. "Any further attack or retaliation by the Houthis will be met with great force, and there is no guarantee that the force will stop there. Iran has played the, quote, innocent victim of rogue terrorists from which they've lost control, but they haven't lost control. They're dictating every move, giving them the weapons, supplying them with the money and highly sophisticated military equipment, and even so-called, quote, intelligence. Every shot fired by the Houthis will be looked upon from this point forward as a shot fired from the weapons and leadership of Iran, and Iran will be held responsible and suffer the consequences, and those consequences will be dire." Those are strong words from the president. For those of us who follow this closely, and at least from my perspective, I'll say excited to hear it. Not that I'm excited for any sort of war, but excited for honesty, because so many times I feel like in public diplomacy, or at least in the way government speaks to its people, even here in the United States, sometimes they dumb everything down when we know that Iran is behind this. Are we about to see an escalation in Iran, Greg?
I think that this is President Trump taking the paws off the policy that he had during his first administration, when we saw the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the head of Iran's proxy networks throughout the world, not just the Middle East, which is, if you attack U.S. interests, or if you indirectly attack the support of U.S. interests, then you will be considered an enemy of the United States and a threat to our national security. This is the extension of President Bush's speech right after 9/11. If you are the terrorist, or if you support the terrorists, then you are going to be targeted by this country. And I find it incredibly irresponsible with presidents who have not been willing to go after the sponsors of those who are attacking the United States. So, if anything, President Trump is continuing a decades, if not centuries long policy of making sure that those who are responsible for arming, equipping, providing funds to actors who are targeting U.S. national security interests will be held equally responsible. This is, even if you want to make the argument, the extension of the Jeffersonian doctrine of going after the capitals of Barbary states that were giving license to pirates to attack us on the high seas at the beginning of this country's existence. So, if anything, instead of corsairs, corvettes, and frigates, you have aircraft carriers, guided missile destroyers, and F-35s. The warfare has changed, but the rationale for doing so has not.
You say it's a continuation of the policy, but just to push back a little bit, or maybe end with a question on it, right? The policy in the first Trump administration was maximum pressure on Iran, which was all economic pressure, right? Turned off almost all of the oil sales coming in and out of Iran and oil transfers, all the money coming in and out. We saw Biden lift those two levels of sanctions. He lifted both of them unofficially, but he just let them get really rich. And then we saw what happened as a result. I'm reminded of a podcast I did, maybe a year ago with former Ambassador David Friedman talking about the impact of flooding Iran with cash and what that's going to do to the region. And by the way, I hadn't even gone back to that podcast, but I'm thinking about it. That was before October 7th. It looks like now, from where I sit, the U.S. is actually looking more towards what they call a kinetic strike, where it can actually an attack on Iran, whether it's on Iran's oil fields, whether it's on their weapons manufacturing facilities, whether it's on their nuclear weapon sites, which would be a very big difference than where the Trump administration was in the first term. What do you think?
Well, I think that, as I referred to before, the strike on Soleimani was hitting the beating heart of Iran's proxy networks throughout the rest of the region.
That's fair.
So if we want to look at that in terms of an escalatory interest of going after Iranian infrastructure, the nuclear program, IRGC bases, yes, that is a increase or an expansion of the way in which the policy was ran at the beginning of the Trump administration or in the first Trump administration. But we saw that after the strike on Soleimani, yes, there was a missive of some missiles which hit an American airbase in Iraq. But at the end of the day, the Iranians were deterred. They stopped their proxy warfare insofar as relating to target U.S. national security interests. But now the stakes are higher. We have a critical global commercial shipping route, which has 12% of the world's maritime traffic. We have partners in the region who are under attack. We have Iranian-backed threats, not just active in Iraq against U.S. bases, but active throughout the entire Middle East, where the U.S. has incredible economic interests. And on the table here is the security of both global energy flows and supply chain security. So, due to the greater threat, I think that President Trump has made the position that it requires a greater response. And in doing so, he's put his cards on the table. And if Iran continues to arm the Houthis, if they continue to allow the Houthis to attack, and this disingenuous argument that the Houthis are acting by themselves, all you have to do is look at the supplies that come from their drones or from their broken missiles, and you'll see manufactured in Tehran. And as a result of that, if there's another attack against the United States or its interests or its allies, you can expect a kinetic response in Iranian territory.
Yeah, and we're seeing responses right now from the Houthis. Although what's interesting is this morning when I was trying to get ready for this podcast, we're recording super early in the morning, 8:30 in the morning. So trying to catch up on the news overnight. And it turns out a lot of the news that came out last night before I went to sleep when I was reading about the Houthis' attacks on U.S. interests and U.S. war vessels. This morning, the buzz is that it was bullshit, excuse the expression, right? They were just sort of bluster, if we want to use the nicer word, right? A lot of bluster coming from the Houthis saying that their attacks are successful. But from where I sit, if you're shooting rockets at U.S. war vessels, even if you miss, that's an act of war. And I think there needs to be responded to accordingly. I just wanted to turn my attention to my favorite, and of course I'm being sarcastic, member of Congress. I'm glad that the president has turned on him as well, Thomas Massie from Kentucky, a great isolationist and who's been coming after, voted against almost everything, or if not everything that's ever happened with regards to Israel or the Jewish people or even Jewish students in the United States or Jews here in our borders. People say, no, he's just a deficit hawk. And that's also, and use the word twice on a show because I'm tired, bullshit. because if you look at his voting record on everything, it really tells a story. You can connect the dots yourself. But his position on this is his isolationist hat, is that this is really just the quote military-industrial complex, because the military-industrial complex, I'm reading from his tweet, demands about $50 billion a year from our government above and beyond what's necessary to defend our own country. And basically, this is Yemen is the new way to spend that money, Yemen and Iran. Just if you want to react to Massey's tweet and position, the position for many, it's not really just on Massey, many in his circles that think that way, that this is just really an invented war to try to continue the military-industrial complex. It's not really serving a U.S. national security interest.
No, I think that Thomas Massey would be happy if America was an island with no one coming on its shores. But unfortunately, that's not the world that we live in. His tweet points to research that speaks only in the top beneficiaries in terms of absolute dollar terms of who has trade through the Suez Canal and across the straits in which the Houthis are threatening. But what he forgets is that supply disruptions in one region can ripple through the entire global economy. Americans will face higher prices for consumers, reduced availability of goods, and increased transportation costs. So even if one area of the globe in terms of our shipping system is hit, it affects the rest of the world. But if the United States is in a position to mitigate disruptions like they're doing right now in day 4 of these attacks on the Houthis, that will affect, in essence, the avoidance of cascading inflationary pressures and shortages that will eventually harm American businesses and consumers. So if you want to make the economic argument, fine, do it in absolute dollar terms, but account for every amount of disruption, whether it be direct or indirect, on the U.S. economy. So there is a very much of an economic argument for the U.S. to intervene, and it's not to support this so-called military-industrial complex. Beyond that, when the U.S. has the ability to stabilize global oil markets, your price at the pump is going to be a lot less. So it's not just about hard goods and software and other things that come through global shipping. It's also about energy. We want to keep oil prices low, and you can't offset the Houthis stopping 12% of the global oil supply by increasing production in the U.S. You have to do both to offset those high prices. Why would we, cut off our nose to spite our face? It doesn't make any sense. That's what he's advocating for.
Yeah, I heard someone make the argument, which I thought was very eloquent, and I would ascribe it to him if I remembered who it was. But what was said, the isolationists, to be isolationists, you have to be okay with America being last, not America being first, right? Because the only way America can lead economically around the world and really to bring the best benefit to Americans here within our borders is to be able to protect shipping routes, is be able to protect U.S. interests outside of our borders. We can't just, like you said, live on an island here and build a huge moat and hope that nothing outside of that island impacts us here. That's just not the world that we live in. By the way, I make a similar argument when people say that the U.S. should stop providing military assistance to Israel. There's a good argument, by the way, to be made even from very pro-Israel people like myself. But the problem with that argument is it only works in a vacuum, right? It only works if Russia stops providing arms, if India stops selling arms, if the whole world says, okay, every country is on its own when it comes to military capabilities, then great. Then Israel should just continue to be on its own. There'll be a powerhouse right alongside the United States in no time. But that's just, again, not the world we live in, right? We have different forces that are pushing for different things all over the world. I just wanted to turn, Greg, if you want to react to that, you can, but I wanted to turn to what's happening in Gaza, because yesterday Israel did open the gates of hell, like President Trump said they would, and that he backed them doing, because Hamas really just stopped negotiating in good faith. They didn't want to extend the ceasefire. They didn't want to release Eden Alexander. They kept really just messing around with the terms that they were able to do under President Biden, but it's like they didn't get a memo that there's a new president in town. And Israel really just took the opportunity, because if they didn't, I don't know if they would get it again, to go back and unleash really just a massive attack on Gaza. Spoke to some soldiers in Israel that are friends, just to try to get an understanding of the scope of the plans. Of course, even the lower level soldiers don't get even company commanders and such don't get insight to what the bigger plans are. But the understanding that I'm getting from friends there is this is just going to be an all-out invasion. There's going to be sort of the reality is the hostages will be at risk in this type of attack, but it's to really just put an end to Hamas and an end to this nonsense in this moment. This thing has been going on for way too long. What's your reaction to Israel escalating and coming back into Gaza?
Well, I think that Israel had the opportunity to offer the Trump administration through the transition from Biden to give him a blank slate for trying to conduct his diplomacy as related not just to U.S. citizens who are being held captive by Hamas, but also in reassessing the region. And you saw for the last 2 months, and I hate to call this hostage diplomacy, but Steve Witkoff, Adam Boehler, others coming to the Middle East, trying to see if diplomacy could work. They gave it a shot. But along with walking softly in the Roosevelt era and carrying a big stick, Hamas didn't realize that Trump's big stick was allowing Israel to do what it had to do to win this war. And frankly, I think when you look at the goals of the war, to degrade, decimate, and dislodge Hamas from Gaza, that is always, I think, the number one goal. Not just to make sure that another October 7th will never happen again, but to telegraph to Israel's enemies in the region that it will go all the way to do what it has to do to protect Israeli citizens. Not through retribution, as a lot of individuals have carried this out as a result of punishing Hamas for the October 7th attacks, but one from the position of deterrence, which is that Israel will never allow an incident like this to happen again. And in order to do that, it has to execute an operation, as you said, opening up the gates of hell. But at the end of the day, you want to have to be able to close those gates as well to make sure that Hamas doesn't have a position in Gaza anymore. Now, I realize that there are over 20 hostages that are still present in the Gaza Strip, and everything Israel can do to try to rescue them or perhaps go for a pause to be able to negotiate for their release is something that I understand is in Israel's short-term tactical interests. But strategically, looking at the chessboard, if Israel is not able to finish this war, to complete its war goals, then you might have the presence of another threat, just like what happened on October 7th. We cannot go back to an October 6th mindset in Israel. And also having served in the army and realizing what the general staff has as its main goals, it is taking its direction from the political class, from the security cabinet. And since the first day of this war, it has been the stated policy of the Israeli government to finish the job. Biden did not allow that happen. It asked Israel to fight with one arm tied behind its back, and even in some cases just take punches to the nose without being able to respond. But I think Trump, after having given diplomacy a chance, Hamas failing at it, now is saying to Israel, finish your war. Do what you have to do to make sure this doesn't happen again. We realize that there's still an American citizen there, Eden Alexander, at least speaking from the U.S. interest of protecting its citizens, but also U.S. interest to be able to allow its allies to do what it has to do to secure themselves so they participate in a global security architecture, which allows the U.S. to ultimately be safe as well. And just going back to the Gilad Shalit deal, when these kidnapped hostage deals go forward, it ends up making Israel less safe. And I think Netanyahu realized that position. He tried to give diplomacy a chance again. There were some exchanges, but Hamas doesn't want to play ball now. And as a result, you have the second round of the war beginning in Gaza as of last night.
Yeah, what people don't understand is that on the right in Israel, which is the majority of Israel these days, thank God, but on the right, there's actually a big criticism of Netanyahu as well, separate from October 7th, talking about the execution of the war. It's hard to understand for many of us how the war has gone on for as long as it's gone on, almost a year and a half, and Hamas is still not just still standing. I think Hamas made a big tactical mistake of waking up the beast a second time by parading around with dead bodies of the Bibas family of hostages, bringing out hostages to see other hostages being released, these parades, these signs, sending the wrong bodies on purpose, sending coffins locked with the wrong keys on purpose, just continuing to poke at Israel. And what that does is it pisses off everybody, right? Everybody, right, left, and center in Israel. And there is going to be a political response. There's definitely a political element to the war. And I think we're seeing that now. And at least on the element of the war, or the goal of the war, which is to end Hamas and to finish them as a political and military entity. We had the ambassador on last week, Yefiel Leiter, Israel's ambassador to the U.S. But to be able to at least accomplish that goal of the war, there needs to be a different type of war. And we've lost way too many. Israel's lost way too many soldiers since this war has started because of the way it's conducted the war, because of its concern of the way the world responds to it. I can call out Piers Morgan, the great intellectual, again, sarcastic for those who couldn't tell, who already is challenging Israel because they said there was a report that 300 were killed on the airstrikes. He doesn't even know who they are, and he already calls it a mass casualty event that he needs to condemn. Right? Israel was too worried about the Piers Morgans of the world and worse, and the Mehdi Hassans and everybody else. Now they need to actually go out and finish the war, at least one part of the war, and God willing, maybe just to be clear, also save the hostages, be able to, like you said, either militarily being able to go out there and rescue them, which has seemed impossible till now, or getting them to surrender, them being Hamas to surrender and actually just hand them over because the attacks will be so overwhelming. I just want to turn to one last thing to be respectful of the time. People are ADD just like me. We need try to keep things around 30 minutes. Gregg, the reason why you came to mind, I've known you for years. I was happy to see you front and center in the USAID scandal. Everyone saw you sitting in the middle of the testimony in U.S. Congress. Your organization, I believe, put out a report exposing all the money that USAID was sending around the world, really counter to U.S. interests, if you ask me. So much so that it caused, as a result of that hearing, it caused the closure of USAID, or at least the transfer of it over to Marco Rubio, their Secretary of State, and the great downsizing of it, not just saving money for the United States in great numbers, but also aligning what the government is doing with the policy of the government. People say the deep state or whatever, but for me, it's more about the right hand and the left hand have to be aligned. And you can't have President Trump at the head and one policy, and then have an agency like USAID just giving out money all over the world for things that are not consistent with U.S. interests. Tell me a little bit about that USAID scandal and your involvement in it.
Sure. So the theory that we posit is that the distribution and allocation of American foreign aid has to be in America's interests, not for political purposes, but to strengthen relationship with countries and to underwrite and invest in communities where we see America will have a net benefit. Unfortunately, this is what was happening over the last 15 years, and maybe even going back further to the time that we were in Afghanistan and Iraq in 2001 and 2003. The U.S. Agency for International Development was directly underwriting organizations that supported terror organizations as classified by the U.S. Treasury and State Departments: Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah. The U.S. taxpayer was funding organizations which were in open alliances on social media, in their own statements, and in their own actions, supporting groups which were anathema to U.S. national security interests. And the American interest in this case is not to support terror organizations or their allies. At the end of the day, we try to make the distinction between waste, fraud, and abuse, and to add a fourth category that no one was speaking about: the fact that the U.S. was investing in organizations that were threatening our security here at home and abroad. And by exposing that, $122 million over a 10-year period, we were able to prompt the committee to look further into it by not just looking at this in terms of its outright egregious ethical conundrum it posed, but also to potentially see criminal actions which were being taken by these organizations using U.S. dollars, the taxpayers' money, to try to underwrite terror. And as a result of that, I think there'll be more hearings on this issue, not just from the spending of USAID money, but we have 9 other investigations into 9 other federal agencies and departments that we'll be revealing over the next year, including the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, FEMA, and other U.S. government agencies, where that money went to radicals rather than going to supporting the U.S. citizen.
Wow. Okay. Give us a little bit more there, Gregg. So you have investigations going on to 9 more agencies in 9 more agencies on waste and abuse, money going to not just against U.S. interests, but to radicals on the other side. You said the Department of Defense as well?
Yep, the Department of Defense was using its monies to underwrite organizations which I would categorize as being radical and against U.S. interests.
Wow, and this is something that your organization, MEF, Middle East Forum, is doing the investigation themselves? Are you doing it in coordination with the DoD now or on your own?
So we share all of our information with U.S. government agencies before we make it public, just to give them the opportunity to act. So nobody, has the opportunity to take their hand out of the cookie jar before they get caught. But we are in broad communications with every element of both the executive and legislative branch, And if people want to know about this, all they have to do is go to our website, meforum.org. We've had these investigations before. Just to give you a little bit of a preview, Iranian influence networks in the United States, 501c3 tax-exempt organizations partnering with terror organizations overseas, groups that are openly calling for the destruction of America and killing Americans who are getting checks from the Department of Homeland Security. This is what you'll see in the weeks and months ahead.
Amazing. Gregg, I need to have you back to reveal those reports before they come out. Thank you for all you do, Gregg. Thanks for shedding a light on this. I know that there's no shortage of opinions when it comes to the Middle East and U.S. foreign policy, but there's only one set of facts. So it's important to get those set of facts, and everyone can form whatever opinions they want. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for your time, Gabe.
Thanks, everyone. Make sure to like, follow, subscribe, do all the great things you do to support podcasts, and we'll see you next time.